Our guest this week on Veterans Chronicles is Major Mary Jennings Hagar, an Air Force veteran of the war in Afghanistan, where she served as a medevac helicopter pilot. She also played a key role in changing military policy for women in combat. And MJ, thanks very much for being with us.
Thank you for having me on. Thanks.
Well, let's start with the beginning of your story. Where were you born and raised?
I was born in Connecticut, but moved to Texas as soon as I could talk enough to convince my mom to move me to Texas. Raised in Texas since I was about 7 years old. Went to the University of Texas at Austin.
Okay, so you're a Longhorn.
Yes, bleed burnt orange.
Yeah, a little better this year.
Yeah.
So when did you join the Air Force, and why did you choose the Air Force?
I went through ROTC at UT Austin, and then I joined the Air Force because I would like to be able to say that it was because I was super patriotic and wanted to be a part of something bigger than myself, and those things were there for sure, but really it was because I wanted to be Han Solo flying a Millennium Falcon in the asteroid field, and I just thought that was cool, and I was looking for the job closest to that. Helicopter pilot in combat sounded kind of good.
That does sound good.
Yeah.
So when did you graduate from UT?
99.
99, okay.
Yeah, you're dating me now.
Well, just trying to get the timeline together here.
Yeah.
So that's before 9/11.
Right.
And so
Yeah.
what are you thinking when you see that happening?
So I was an aircraft maintenance officer first. I was stationed in Japan, but I was back in Kirtland in New Mexico during 9/11 at the Aircraft Mishap Investigator School, learning how to analyze crash sites for causal purposes. 9/11 happened, and that was horrifying, just like it was for everybody, but it definitely renewed my resolve. That's kind of how I've always responded to threats or intimidation or bullying or attempts to coerce. It always just solidifies my resolve to be, to fight those types of powers even harder.
Mm-hmm. And how much pilot work do you have at this point?
I had my private license, or actually I was just about to get my private license. So I actually got my private license to try to make me a more attractive candidate to be picked up by the military for pilot training. And I got my license right after that class in the weeks, like the very close post 9/11 environment, which was really interesting because they had shut down all the schools, so they had just opened them up. There were all these restrictions, and it was a crazy time to get your license.
Did you know you wanted to be a medevac pilot, or did you have different ideas, or did you not really care?
Actually, I wanted to be an A-10 pilot my whole career. I thought that the maneuverability and the fact that the aircraft was built around the gun, the ground support element of the A-10 was what attracted me. Like most people in the Air Force, I wasn't even really all that familiar with the helicopter missions. So I applied to a few different units, and when I got picked up by an A-10 unit and a PAPOC unit, I had to make a choice. And I thought, well, that's no choice. I'll go with the A-10. Of course, that's what I've always wanted to do. But I got a call from their commander, the helicopter unit commander. But he made the point that the A-10s are, training, and they only get to use their skill set in combat. Whereas if I went the PAPOC route, I would do training, and then I would be using my real-world mission during peacetime. Doing search and rescue, getting people off boats, eradicating marijuana, putting out wildfires, all sorts of things that you could do during peacetime, and that sold me.
How much of it also was just the fact that he wanted you that much?
I think he did. He became a mentor of mine later. I was the first female pilot in that unit. I think he was trying to, it was kind of a good old boys club up in New York on Long Island, as you can imagine, a bunch of really great guys to work with. A lot of them are my heroes, but there's a culture up there with the New York, police department and firefighters, and there's definitely a culture up there that's not that diverse.
So how were you welcomed to your unit once you made that
By
decision?
the majority of people with open arms. I feel like the more interesting and more informative to the narrative parts are the times I got discriminated against, but unfortunately the boring, more welcoming camaraderie times don't make it into the story, really. Majority of them are amazing, great guys that I had a lot of respect for. Heroes of mine, actually. Mm-hmm. The guys from the Perfect Storm mission.
Did that manifest itself? How did it manifest itself? Let's put it that way.
I spent some time at that unit before I went to pilot training, and I was very aware that I was walking the halls with heroes, and that when I went off to pilot training, I was determined to earn my place among them. After pilot training, we went to Afghanistan, and I had a gunner tell me he didn't want to fly with me because I was a woman, and that he didn't think I could hold my own in an invasion scenario. And I said, well, all right, let's figure this out right now. And I dropped down in the push-up position and started doing push-ups. And I was like, come on, Chief, you know. And he got mad and walked away, you know. But so there were a couple of people that I had to win over.
Did he end up your gunner?
Yes, begrudgingly. I don't count him as one of the people I won over. So.
Was he pretty comfortable with you once he saw what you could do?
I don't think he ever saw me in an evasion scenario.
Oh.
You know, I mean, later in the story, I did get shot down and I did hold my own. So I always wondered if I'd get a phone call from him saying I was wrong, but I'm still waiting.
When were you first deployed to Afghanistan?
2007.
Okay. In what area?
Kandahar.
And how long was that tour?
That tour was actually, I did 2 tours in place. So the Air Force does shorter tours. So I did 3 tours in Afghanistan, and to the Army, that sounds like I lived there for 4 years. But in the Air Force, and especially in the Guard, we do like 4 to 6 month deployments. And in the Guard, if you have enough people, you can split that up into an A and B rotation. So I did my first deployment with the New York Air National Guard, A and B rotation. And then I was just having so much fun that I, not just fun, but also felt like I was doing good and rescuing people and trying to make, trying to do some good in such a horrifying place like a war zone. I felt very lucky that we were a rescue platform. So I actually volunteered to stay in place when my unit went home. I had heard that one of the guys coming in to replace us, his wife was just about to have a baby. So I said I would stay and do his tour so that he could. That's part of the reason I take a lot of umbrage with the argument about women in combat, because, you know, we'll have to replace them when they get pregnant and things like that. It's ridiculous because I replaced a guy whose wife was pregnant. It's just we're all family and we cover for each other. It shouldn't be about who's actually carrying the kid, you know. So that was my second tour, was in place with Kadena.
Okay. I think it's your third tour that we're going to get to the most dramatic part. But what was the first medevac mission like for you?
I was very excited. I went straight from training. In fact, I cut my training short and sent me to Afghanistan, which was not standard. I felt like, you know, when I got to New York and started doing the local orientation, they told me early on I wasn't going to make the deployment. I would still be doing training. But then I was proving myself, and they said, okay, we'll take you early, which was great. But because of that, I was one of the only people who didn't have a rescue under my belt already. And there's some crass terms for that I won't use here. But I was eager to get that, you know, shine off the apple kind of thing and become a real rescue pilot. So I was in Afghanistan. I was on alert in a place called Tarin Kowt. We were forward deployed supporting some special forces guys, and the radio went off. I was like taking a shower or something, the radio went off and I got all excited. I ran across these big rocks, which was stupid. I could have twisted an ankle, and, you know, threw on my uniform and put on my helmet, and I could feel my wet hair dripping down the back, you know, and all of the dust was like just congealed on me because I was right straight from the shower. And I think I let loose a yeehaw and I jumped in the aircraft. I was very excited. We had a arm gunshot wound, and I was just eager to get my first rescue out of the way, and jumped in the helicopter, headed that way, and we were about 5 minutes out, and the ground team called and asked us if we brought blood with us. And we kind of looked at each other like, why would we? No, we didn't bring blood. And at this point, we can't turn around because we're 5 minutes out. But it made us all go, wait a minute. We thought we had like an arm gunshot wound, and it was, but it went inside the chest cavity also. And the LZ was under fire. We're not supposed to land under fire. We're supposed to wait till they suppress the threat. But, you know, you're not supposed to make tactical decisions like this, but the reality is we're human. We're going in to pick up an American Special Forces troop who needs blood, so we're going to land. So we landed under fire. The ground team is returning fire, trying to suppress the threat long enough to get the wounded soldier on board. We got him on board. My medic in the back started working on him. We beelined back to Tarin Kowt. We actually left our wingman, which is really dangerous for them and for us. But we just pulled the guts out of the aircraft, and we had a stronger, faster aircraft, so we just left them behind. Beeline for the hospital, didn't fly tactically or anything like that. Got him there, and he expired on the surgical table. And that was horrifying to me, and I tell that story kind of as penance to myself for being excited about going. Because as a medevac pilot, when you get the call, that means somebody else is having a really bad day. that guy had an 8-year-old little girl at home, and I remember cleaning out the blood and the dust from the back of the helicopter with bleach and just beating myself up over how could that have gotten me excited. And it really grew me up as a pilot that day, and I never again wished for a mission. I was like, this isn't about me and fulfilling my adrenaline dream. This is about saving people's lives.
So duty called. It wasn't yeehaw anymore.
Never again.
Is the medevac chopper armed in any way?
Dust Off is not. We are. We're combat search and rescue. We do not carry the Red Cross, and actually one of my favorite things to do is surprise an enemy who thinks they have an easy target because they're trying to take down a Dust Off bird who I feel very protective of, our Dust Off brothers and sisters. One of my closest friends is a Dust Off pilot, and I take it personal that they choose to shoot at them because it's safer, because they're not shooting back. So I like to surprise them with our teeth, and be like, you thought that was an easy target, hey, and return fire and maybe make them think twice about firing on Dust Off.
Not only is the medevac Dust Off mission harrowing for the person being rescued, of course, it can be harrowing, obviously, for the people doing the rescuing, and that's exactly what happened in the summer of 2009.
Yes.
Explain the situation.
We launched on a medevac for a convoy that had hit an IED. There were 3 urgent American casualties. And when we got on scene, there were 2 Army Kiowas providing cover support. And the Kiowas are beautiful little recon helicopters, 2-seaters. They've got skids underneath them, which are kind of like skis. And they're heavily armed with rockets and machine guns and beautiful little support helicopters. They were on scene providing support for the convoy. We came in 2-ship. Our standard operating procedure is to land and deplane our special forces guys. They're called PJs, pararescue jumpers. They jump out and deal with the patient while we land for a split second. They jump out and we take off, because if we stay in the zone, first of all, we're vulnerable, but it also kicks up a lot of dust and a lot of noise that makes their job harder. So as we landed, in that split second that we landed and took off, I took a round through the co-pilot's windshield that fragmented into several pieces. So I say that I got shrapnel wounds. I don't say that I got a gunshot wound, because when you say gunshot wound, you picture like a Hollywood gunshot wound, but it was probably a Soviet era bullet, so it just kind of fragmented into a bunch of pieces and got into my right arm and leg, which unfortunately caused a lot of blood, but not a lot of damage. It was all superficial damage, so it looked bad to my crew, but I knew immediately that I was fine. So as we were circling and waiting to pick up the patients, my crew was having the discussion on whether or not to return to base, whether or not we were disabled enough to return to base, because on that aircraft, everything is redundant. We have 2 hydraulic systems, 2 fuel systems, 2 engines, 2 pilots, and if one of those things is down, you have to return to base, because if I was incapacitated and the other pilot got hit, then what would happen to the crew? So we determined that I was fine, and we circled around, landed to pick up our patients, and unfortunately, unbeknownst to us, the light fire that they had been taking under ambush was actually what we call a SAR trap. That was what we call that. I don't know what they call it, but they had 150 enemy fighters in the area just specifically to down a bird. They wanted to injure an American. They knew we would send in a helicopter. They wanted to down a helicopter. So now, knowing where we were going to land, because we landed the first time, they had repositioned a heavy belt-fed machine gun. So now, instead of a single guy with a Soviet-era rifle, now it's like a crew-served weapon with 7.62, like larger rounds. So we landed and immediately started taking fire from the tail to the nose, but very slowly, because it's hard to maneuver a weapon like that. And as the patients were being loaded, we were losing so many systems that one of the systems is a horizontal stabilizer, and that made the horn start going off in our intercom, so we couldn't talk to each other. There is a button you can silence to make the horn stop, but everything was happening so fast, and we just, we weren't thinking about that. But so I was giving a hand signal to the other pilot to stay on the ground. He had actually only been in country for 2 weeks, and because I was volunteering for deployments, I actually had the most combat hours of any pilot in our rescue community. It's a small community at the time, but they partner the more experienced people with the less experienced people on purpose, So he was listening to me, and keeping the aircraft on the ground, which I highlight because I think that's amazing. He couldn't see. I couldn't tell him why I was saying stay on the ground, against his survival instincts for himself, right. But also he's the aircraft commander. He's responsible for everyone's lives and the aircraft, and he just stayed on the ground. So had he lifted, he would have hurt or killed someone who was loading people in the aircraft. As soon as they were finished, I gave him the go-ahead, and he picked up. We were barely clearing the terrain as it was. It was hot. We were heavy. High altitude, not necessarily like the highest, but we were barely clearing the terrain. The aircraft was very hobbled. We had lost hydraulics. The caution panel looked like a Christmas tree. Just lights everywhere, and I was trying to prioritize what systems to take care of. My flight engineer in the back said, hey, we've got fuel. So I immediately looked at the fuel gauge, and there's 2 fuel systems. Each one feeds the engine. So the number 1 fuel system feeds number 1, number 2 system feeds number 2. And I looked down, the number 1 was completely empty. Not ticking down, not leaking, completely empty. And my aircraft mishap investigation training kicked in, and I thought, well, I don't want them to find me causal when they analyze the crash site. So I'm going to move the fuel selector into crossfeed, which feeds both engines off the same tank, so that when they analyze the crash site, I'm not found causal. I was already there, and I must have looked at it right when it extinguished, because miracle of miracles, we kept flying. But now we had a leak in the number 2. So when that happens, number 2 is obviously, that's our lifeblood. And I looked at it, and it started ticking down. And it's possible that the leak was somewhere between the number 1 engine and the fuel lines, so that when we started feeding from number 2, it started leaking. So we had to face the reality of, we're going to have to land.
MJ, you're in this dramatic story. You're losing fuel. You've already lost it on one side. You're dramatically losing it on the other. What happened next?
So now we're faced with one of the worst options as a rescue pilot, is we have to put the aircraft down in the middle of the desert, in the middle of bad guy territory, with no security perimeter. It's pretty unheard of to do. And then it's also embarrassing, because we're a rescue platform, and now all of a sudden we become the survivor, and we have to put other rescue forces' lives at risk to come rescue us. So it's not what we want to be in. We have patients on board that we're trying to protect. So we made it about 1.8 miles away from the convoy before we had to put the aircraft down. My aircraft commander put it down beautifully, saved all of our lives, hydraulics off. It's kind of like driving an 18-wheeler with no power steering. Did like a light crash, heavy, hard landing. As the aircraft was winding down, we had executed an emergency shutdown, and the rotors were starting to slow down, the engines were starting to slow down. I jumped out of my seat, pulled out my rifle, started walking backwards, hit the wheel that I forgot was protruding, so it wasn't all that graceful. Backed up to the cabin, looked inside, saw that my patients didn't have body armor on. So I looked around and took what I perceived as the heaviest threat and turned my body armor to place that between the threat and the patients, to continue protecting my patients while we waited for exfiltration. One of the PJs, Special Forces guys, Air Force Special Forces guys, I felt him on my shoulder, on my left shoulder, and I looked, and it was still too loud really to talk, and he nodded, and he said, yep, you watch that quadrant, I've got 6 to 9, I've got 9 to 12, and looked that I was protecting the patients and nodded like, yeah, keep doing that. Did that for a while until he determined that we were taking more fire from that side of the aircraft than the other guys, so we decided to button up that side of the aircraft, shut the door. The door was providing more ballistic, protection for the patients. And so we did that, climbed inside, tried to help defend the perimeter from the other side. And about this time, we're wondering why our sister ship isn't landing. That's why we go everywhere to ship, is because you're supposed to land pretty immediately and get everybody on board before the enemy's wise to what you're doing. But they were still circling. So we're 20 minutes in now and wondering why they're not landing. And the Kiowa pilots are also, this is just my version of the story. I'm sure they have a different version. This is from my perspective.
Sure.
Kiowa pilots are also wondering why they're not landing. They come over the radio and they say the worst thing that we've ever heard. We were Pedro, they were Seamus, so they come across the radio and they say, Pedro 1-5, Seamus 3-5 is bingo, fuel, and ammo. We're going to have to leave, but we'll be back. They knew, and we knew, when they came back we wouldn't be there. They were the only things keeping the enemy back. So we were deflated. And then they said, well, we've got a crazy idea. And we were like, yep, we'll take that, whatever it is. And they said, well, we'll land next to you. Hopefully we'll show your sister ship that it's safe to land. And you guys can put the patients on your sister ship, get the crew to just hang on to the outside of the Kiowa. And Governor Schwarzenegger was our commander-in-chief at the time of the California Air National Guard, and so somebody said, "Get to the chopper," and we ran out to the Kiowas and, stood on the skid, swung my leg over and squeezed the mount that goes from the fuselage to the rocket pod between my knees and pushed my back against the fuselage, braced my rifle on the rocket pod. And as I did that, I turned and I looked and I saw that my flight engineer, who was like a brother to me, who was running out to the Kiowas, had turned around and gone back to the crash site because he saw one of the PJs struggling with one of the litters. And our sister ship did land, but they landed about a football field away. So he knew they were going to have a really hard time getting the patients there. And I couldn't jump off the aircraft. It was too late. It was starting to get what we call light. But I turned and looked and saw the enemy, who had been dug in all day and not giving us a point of origin, so we couldn't fire on them. You can't just spray bullets where you think the enemy is. They were emboldened by the fact that we were getting exfiltrated out, so they abandoned their dug-in position and started encroaching and giving me a point of origin. So that now they're firing at us, and I can see their muzzle flashes. So I start returning fire. I turn back and I look. I'm really just trying to get the attention of the guys on the ground and saying, "Hey, they're coming," because I'm not up on a radio or anything like that. So I start firing, but then the aircraft starts to take off, and I have to stop firing. It's one of the hardest things I ever did, because now I don't know if the other aircraft's about to swing around in my line of fire. If you're not up on comms, you shouldn't be pulling the trigger. So I had to stop pulling the trigger. I turned and looked one last time and still saw my brothers struggling with the patients and the enemy encroaching on their position. That's the last thing I saw. Longest 10 minutes of my life, that trip, hanging onto the outside of that helicopter, getting to the forward operating base where they could refuel and rearm. As soon as they landed, I stepped off the bird and started heading toward the Tactical Operations Center. I'm walking with a purpose. And you have to picture, I've got my flight suit tied around my waist. I'm covered in gas, covered in blood, but I have body armor on. I have my helmet on, my visor down. I'm heavily armed. And this poor young Army private runs up to me and says, Sir, I need to check out your wounds. It was clear somebody had radioed ahead and said, "We're bringing in a wounded pilot." He was a medic. He's like, "Sir, I need to check out your wounds." And I'm like, "Out of my way. I'll come find you in a minute." But I had to go find out what happened after I left. I'm looking for a vehicle to hotwire to get back out there, And he's like, I understand, sir, but I have to check you out. And I said, "Look, you can see my arm has stopped bleeding. I'm fine. I'll come find you in a minute." And he's like, "Sir," he's running backwards because I'm not stopping. And he's like, "Sir, I must insist. I have to check out your leg." And I was like, "Fine." So I undid my flight suit and I pulled it down and I was like, "See, it's fine." And it was like a needle off the record on that forward operating base. And I was like, What's the big deal? And I looked down and I was wearing Hello Kitty underwear. And I'm trying to be all tough, and there's Kitty going, "Tuesday," And I was like, what's the big deal? I'm a woman, so what? And I pulled my pants back up and, headed to the talk and found out that everybody got out okay. It was a miracle. The crash site later, they went out to cargo sling the crash site out, and they were cutting off the rotor blades, and a spark from cutting off the blade ignited the whole thing and lit it on fire. And I just don't understand how we didn't have more people hit. We didn't get lit on fire with the fire we were taking. Nobody had an RPG. I mean, it's pretty amazing that we all got out that day.
So you came home after that.
Yes.
You got married.
I did.
So that's a good thing.
Yeah.
And then you wanted to go back.
Well, I wanted to go back before I got married. Pretty much as soon as I hit the ground. But I was medically disqualified from flying after that. I had messed up my back pretty bad, and I had been struggling with a knee injury my whole career, which was why I didn't get a pilot slot out of ROTC. So it was really more of a question of I stopped fighting all of the physical injuries that I was racking up. But there was a job that I would have been perfect for called Special Tactics Officer, where you go in with the Army and you coordinate their air support. You call in their airstrikes, you call in their medevacs. It takes a couple of really unique skills to be good at that job. You have to have composure under fire, because when they use you, it means they're under fire. Composure, a good radio voice. Panic on the radio is insidious. It'll make everybody panic. Not good. You have to have a good understanding of 3D airspace, and you have to speak pilot, which is like a whole new language. I was perfect for that job. I couldn't apply because I was a woman. So I didn't think, I'm going to fight this. I thought, well, that's a real shame for the military that I love, to be losing me as an asset, because now that I can't fly, I can't go back to a desk job. So I got out, or I was about to get out, when I got a phone call from the ACLU saying, hey, we think the ground combat exclusion policy is outdated. And I was like, the what? There's a policy that keeps women out of combat? It didn't do anything for me, you know? And they said, exactly. We're trying to gather stories of women who excelled in ground combat to show people what women can do and to repeal that policy. And it really wasn't, it shouldn't have become an argument about whether or not women could serve in combat, because we were already doing it. Not just me in a defensive situation, but there were women in offensive combat roles that were Marine female engagement teams, or going and kicking in doors, and, you know, they needed women on those teams so that they could pat down, you know, the women that were there, or there's plenty of reasons they needed women in combat. It just didn't reflect the reality of the battleground or the battlefield, and it was tying the hands of the commanders in the field. So we filed a lawsuit. Technically, it was Hagar et al. V. Panetta, which is Secretary Panetta, but it really wasn't an MJ versus the military thing. The Joint Chiefs of Staff all unanimously recommended to the Secretary of Defense that he repeal the policy. They knew that it was bad for the military also. And it was really more of a, let me give the Secretary more collateral reason to repeal the policy like I know he wants to. He repealed the policy quickly. But then the real fight started. You know, Jeff Sessions, who was a senator from Alabama at the time, said that he was going to legislate the policy back in place. So I co-founded the Combat Integration Initiative with Colonel Ellen Herring. And that was really code for like 40 really pissed off female combat vets. And we stormed the Hill and talked to, you know, congressmen and women and senators, and more importantly, their staffers, like where the real work is done, and just did everything we could to keep that legislation from coming about. And we were so far, we're successful. We've had a female infantry officer, Marine infantry officer, and a couple of women have gone through part of the Navy SEAL training and washed out, but there's a very high washout rate for men too. So I'm excited to see that it's progressing. We want to keep the standards high. We just want anyone who can meet those standards to have the opportunity to compete for a position.
Same standards?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, same standards as long as those standards are appropriately job-specific and not arbitrarily high to specifically keep out a group of people. You know, I've heard the argument, well, you have to be able to pull a 200-pound Marine out of a burning MRAP. Okay, then flip a MRAP and put a 200-pound dummy in it and see who can drag him out. You can't say 31 pull-ups equates to pulling a Marine out. That just doesn't make sense. There's more to it. Center of gravity, you know, your body mass and things like that. So.
Okay. So did this actually lead to you getting the job you wanted then?
No, unfortunately it did not. By the time all jobs were open, I was already on my way out. I had met my soulmate, who I actually met when I was 7, but I didn't realize then that he was my soulmate. Re-met my soulmate. Got married, started having kids. I was getting older. At this point, I didn't even know if I could physically, you know, take the rigors of being a special tactics officer, and I was already in a civilian job, and so it was pretty much too late for me. What
was your reaction when Secretary Panetta lifted the policy?
Celebration, but cautious optimism. You know, I knew we still had a long road ahead. He had announced that the services had 3 years to conduct some studies and to, I mean, the good news was now the jobs were, they used to be closed and you could open them by exception. Now they were open and you had to close them by exception. So that in itself was great. And then I started seeing some real BS studies come out. Oh, you know, there's the one that people love to throw in everyone's faces. They took some units, they made one all-male Marines and they made one a co-ed Marine unit, and then they pitted them against each other. Well, sure, there's no way to, you know, make that have the outcome that you want, right? There's no way to put, like, all the good marksmen in this unit or, you know, select what female Marines go into this unit. It was the only study that showed there might be a problem. All of the other objective studies have been amazing. There have been great results, just like I knew that there would be.
So the Marines were the one branch that really tended to push back?
Well, there were a lot of Marines that weren't pushing back, that were very excited and open-minded, but there have been some, and not just Marines. There were reports of some women going through Army Ranger training that graduated the training just fine and then didn't get assigned to a unit, went back to their logistician job, or graduated the training and then reported being asked to do certain things that the men weren't even asked to do, or carry more weight, or do you know, it was the unofficial, invisible barriers that some people, I don't think any institution was trying to keep women from, but some people in those institutions were trying to erect, you know, these insidious, invisible barriers, and probably still are.
Did you think you'd be writing a book and be the subject of a movie?
No. I initially wrote a book about rescue forces in Afghanistan because I was sick of everyone thinking I was in the Army. And sick of defending our platform every time we'd come up for funding and having people go, what? The Air Force has helicopters? So I wanted to inform people about what rescue forces were doing in Afghanistan and a little bit of an ulterior motive of what women were doing in combat. And it didn't sell. Nobody wants to read it like an academic history. And my agent said, you know, the only thing people care about is personal stories. They want to hear your story. And I'm an introvert, and I'm actually, believe it or not, a very private person. And I said, no, there's no way. And she said, well, how badly do you want to inform the national conversation? You keep telling me you want to educate people. You have to tell your story. So I was like, okay, I'll try it. I wrote up a book proposal, and the book proposal sold. And I was still not really on board. I was like, I don't know. The book proposal then sold to TriStar to become a movie immediately. And I was like, oh crap, I'm going to have to write this thing now. And I better write it fast or they're going to make up whatever they want about the story. So I wrote it in like 4 months, and it was a crazy ride. And I'm glad I did it now. Women reach out to me, men reach out to me, telling me that they're inspired and thank you for telling the story. And it gives us a way to talk about sexual assault and discrimination and PTSD and some really important, you know, topics.
Well, your legacy is probably more profound than you realized when you first signed up for ROTC there at the University of Texas. But congratulations on the success you've had in changing policy. Thank you for your service and your time with us today.
Thank you so much for having me on.
Absolutely. Mary Jennings Hagar, Major at the U.S. Air Force, veteran of the war in Afghanistan. I'm Greg Corombos. This is Veterans Chronicles.